Hello, Dylan, Amanda, Tyler, and Erica. I've often started hello historians or hello learners or something, but with this small group, I can name all of you. So thank you for showing up, even as some of you are in your finals or are into your summer break. I've been on summer vacation for about a week and a half, as I was just saying in the chat. So I put a couple polls in there, but I'm really also interested in your questions about this. I'm going to share, up top, I shared a blog I did earlier today about kind of how this happened or how I got interested in this, which has a lot to do with my own experiences as a teacher and a parent, a longtime teacher and a parent. And I had the experience a couple years ago. I teach juniors, where students take world history in 11th grade in most of Minnesota. And the juniors who I had in class were the same age as my daughter 2 years ago. She just graduated from high school. So I had just sort of a better sense of what their overall lives and understanding was. It was really useful to me as a teacher, seeing her stress. She was in a lot of AP classes. But also quite interesting and thinking about how the change over time for myself from experiencing 9/11 with my students, like trying to figure out what was happening that day when it happened. Here in Minnesota, the attacks happened during first period. And our school starts pretty early, and I found out like at the very end of first period. So then second period, people are trying to figure out what's happening. From that moment where the students and I had like the exact same amount of information, basically, to then developing materials to help kids contextualize it. And then they would have memories, and I would have memories plus this other knowledge. But now that students don't, and what I think some students experience. I'd be curious, either again in chat or in the questioning, if this is your experience, but it was such an intense event for people who were like, following it in real time, that we don't often like explain. Like people will just say the events of September 11 or 9/11 and kind of expect that everybody knows what that means, but we experienced it very differently. So it brings up just a lot of interesting things, and I think it impacts other, there are a lot of different kinds of classes that students might take too, but also just being a student. So if you wouldn't mind, the few of you here, do people doing the poll get that? Oh, that's interesting. Is it something that, daily Pledge of Allegiance? It was an interesting effect of this, like in St. Paul. I live in St. Paul, but I teach in a different school district. And like, there are a lot of classrooms that didn't even have an American flag up. And so like when school board decided everyone needed to start saying the pledge occasionally, it obviously had not been happening. We go once a week at my school. And I said opportunity because you don't have to, right? That's Supreme Court ruling. It has to do with religious freedom and freedom of conscience. So if that is not something that you wish to do, the school should not try to make you. So, all right. So in classes, what classes then have you wound up talking about this in? I'm going to share my slides here, but we can just talk about whatever. World history? That's great. We didn't. Yeah, I don't, man, maybe a mention at the end of the year. The thing that's difficult as a teacher, and we were just talking about when schools start and end. So for me, we start after Labor Day, which I'm guessing is true for New Jersey, given when you get out. Yeah, right. That's when something like that. So I haven't had the students for maybe a week when this happens. And so it's so heavy that and I don't know them real well. And then at the end of the year, stuff just gets kind of crazy. When it fits in, you're trying to finish the curriculum. We don't have a state test I get kids ready for here, but we do have a district final, a common final, and there isn't a 9/11 question on it. So, at the end, and I don't ever want to do it quickly. So in any case, but in U.S. history, I have to. But usually, I'll ask students and just kind of open the floor. In some classes, we have a big discussion. In some classes, we don't. So I am going to share my screen, but I'm going to keep my eyes here. And again, with this small group, you just let me know if you have something you want to say. I'd be happy to bring you on. All right, share screen. There we are. Let's go Fiveable, right? Presenter view. There we go. All right. That's me. Some of you have seen me then for doing some AP World streams, but I teach world history in Minnesota. Fiveable. This is a little bit what I just said or was in the blog post. There we are. All right. Sorry, I'm just getting my presenter view set up. Okay, here's a little bit of my story. So what I wound up doing when I realized, I had the kids in my class who had only, were babies when it was born, like literally, like as I mentioned there, my daughter was less than a month old. So I had that group of kids and I knew that they'd kind of had that experience. And so I just asked them all to write a question. I had 3 classes as far as schedule and some extra different responsibilities I have. So every kid in 2 AP classes, 1 on-level class, for what that's worth, and 11th graders. So they wrote questions, and I took them home, and I cut them up if they weren't, or I fold them on slips, and I took pictures of them in groups. I could kind of talk about them with them. So here are some, which I don't know if you can read or not, but you can kind of see the question that they have going there. And so one of the things that was interesting to me, thinking about this, like as a history teacher, is that I'm a primary source for some things, but I'm a secondary or tertiary source for others. So one of the questions that came up a lot is this. And to some degree, it's like in talking about, and this is a way that it's like talking about other things in education, because as a world history teacher, I talk about a lot of pretty terrible things that happened in history. When I taught U.S. history, I talk about different, massacres. I don't know if you've had APUSH and talked about Sand Creek Massacre, Colorado, as American Indians killed by, U.S. troops in Colorado. Or even, obviously the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide or, colonialism, if you've had AP World and studied the Congo. Like, there's really no good answer for, like, why do these things happen? Stalin. Like, there's no good answer. Like, it's not, that's always, to me, actually, like, as a history teaching person or a history thinking about person, that's a little hard to know, causation, like, why do things happen? Well, there's always the risk, I feel like, in describing causation, that I'm letting people know, like, this was a problem. So one of the things I did with students, and I don't know, is this something that you know about? Do you know about Al-Qaeda? Right? Or what they were trying to do? So it's a good way to think about what terrorism is, right? What does it mean to be a terrorist? Well, terrorism is trying to get people to react. So one of the things we talk about then is, what's the reaction? What are they looking for? Did we react that way, like as a country? If so, is that good or not? it is it's tough to say. The word Al-Qaeda just literally means the base in Arabic, and it's a group that came out of a couple of different events in world history, which we also should talk about. So many of the people, the original founders of Al-Qaeda, like Osama bin Laden, were people who were involved in the Afghan resistance against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So people from around the Muslim world came to Afghanistan as mujahideen, which means volunteers, to fight against the Soviet Union. And then when that war was ended, a lot of these people went back and they were battle hardened and radicalized, just loose in the world. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say kind of conspiracy theory things that the United States trained Osama bin Laden or created Osama bin Laden. That's not really true. The US was on the same side as a lot of unsavory people in the Cold War, including Saddam Hussein in Iraq and different dictators in Latin America, as you might have learned. So, it's an overstatement to say that, but Osama bin Laden was on the same side as the United States during the Cold War. And this is one of the things, too, in talking about this with students, is kind of finding that spot in between thinking critically, which is good, but there's so much like junk out there about this that it can be difficult. So if you have questions, like I said, there's a small group here, so you just go ahead and put those right into the chat. So I shared this with students, and it's interesting. Students were very interested in seeing this, this kind of presented. And I think it's an important part, like as a teacher, it's an important way of dealing with some of the Islamophobic results of 9/11, and then since then, and the war in Iraq, is like to name it. We're talking about, this is the group Al-Qaeda, which used to be kind of a household name, but isn't anymore. So I think that's important. This is what it is, and it's a group that's been really degraded, meaning they have less capability than they used to because of all the U.S. military intervention since 9/11. So, excuse me, but kind of naming, like I said, so naming that group. So it's not just Muslims, because like I said, these are sociopaths. It's not like fringe. These are fringe human beings. People who would do something like this, but so kind of specifying it. And that way, and Al-Qaeda had a history, so this is coming. They'd attacked American targets before this, and they tried to attack American targets after. If you're curious, ISIS as an organization came out of was originally an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, or a kind of Al-Qaeda branch. Al-Qaeda is and was not really a top-down organization. This isn't like the mafia. There's not like Bin Laden is not like the Godfather. I've heard like the organization described more like he's a venture capitalist, and he has capital to invest in waging war against Western cultural influence and military influence in the Middle East. And so he would, groups could use the brand, and they would provide networking and money in some cases. Bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia. His family made a lot of. Oh wow, yeah, that's very interesting, Mr. Tyler. Thank you. Let me finish my thought here, and then I'll kind of look at that a little more closely. So in any case, would kind of add their brand to things, and so the group ISIS, is related to that in some way, but isn't directly connected. So I'm curious, what do students learn at what kinds of things what kinds of things do you think your kids will see at the Freedom Foundation? And while you're thinking about that, if you want to, feel free to share if you want. Oh, you're going. Oh, you're going, and the students will go. And when you say 9/11 veteran, I assume that means you're part of that cohort of people who enlisted after 9/11. And that's sort of part of my lived memory and experience too. So when that happened, I was when that on 9/11, I was 34, 33. But since then, I've seen, like, so at Veterans Day assembly, we'll have students who are currently serving will sometimes, oh wow, okay, so you were, yeah, so things changed a lot um during that time. Um so I know, like, students, I'll see their names up as currently serving, when we honor military service men and women. And some of them who joined, enlisted 2002, 3, 4. Yeah. Dylan's question here asking about desensitization. I really feel like the school shootings have had a much bigger role in that. I feel like, and it might be interesting to know, like, I don't know exactly where you are in New Jersey, dealing with people in the New York area, if they would have a different experience. But for students here, I mean, it was pretty far, it was pretty far away what was going on in Iraq, excuse me, in New York, and then later in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Those things seem kind of far away. And I think the first person, um, like view of the like those shootings, like the kids who like streamed some of that, like in Parkland, when there was stuff streamed like from inside a closet or in a classroom or whatever. So so then, Dylan, you have some of those like secondary memories. Then is this something your family, talks a lot? And is this something that your family discusses? People like, that was interesting when I talked with this with my students last year, who are all like 9/12 generation. Um, Not, so the student that, and so my students last year, some of them were their mothers were pregnant with them when it happened, right? Of course, I had juniors last year, so they were born in 2001 and 2002. Um, and so there was this kind of more of a connection than I realized. So, and a lot of people who had family stories. So it'd be an interesting kind of project thing to do. Family stories where they family knew somebody who was in the city, or knew somebody who was going to fly, or knew somebody who was going to DC, and all that. So, all right, let's take a look at the next next deal here. So here's a world history connection that sometimes comes up when we talk about ISIS also. And it's I don't know how your teacher handled it, or Miss Tyler, if you teach world history, but I'm talking about the caliphates now with ISIS and this connection to Osama bin Laden. You don't give people the idea necessarily that the caliphates are any more like violent than the other time, because you know they're not. But that does provide another window into it. So now all of a sudden this is history. So when I'm talking about this with the students, like now it's back to like I'm the expert. So these family stories kind of fade. It's like, well, because I know about the caliphate and all that. And then there's caliphates. Like this map is, I think, a Wikipedia map, but it never was one caliph who claimed sovereignty over all these areas. But that's kind of how it connects in. So the difference then between like history and memory is, like, having lived through that, is that at the time we didn't know that things were done right. So these attacks happened, and there's places struck in New York and Washington D.C. But then now we know that was it, and there were other effects and other affiliated groups and kinds of attacks, but nothing else happened. But of course, at the time, we don't know that. It's interesting thinking about that as a history teacher, because we have to remember that for any of these experiences, whether it's something that seems kind of similar, like Pearl Harbor, or if it's something that maybe doesn't, like another, any other event in history, that the people who are living through it don't have that same experience with it. So this is the next groups. I did that one day. So one day, I spent about 15, 20 minutes in my class. Kind of just answered questions. Things like this that were really about that experience. What was that experience like? So I did create this slides I had, and I converted them into Fiveable stuff today. But this is a lot of it. It's exactly what I showed in class. Just kind of showing people what we would day we did these things for hang. Like we didn't know how many people. We didn't know what was next. But then for the people doing the research on the topic, the 9/11 Memorial Foundation is really a great resource. There's just a lot of primary resources in there that a person could, repurpose, and including, photos like this. I think really important in this generation, and this is again where you have the memory. Here's what happened. I could tell kids what I experienced. Other kids could share what their parents have told them, or the family members, friends of the family. But there's also this also functions as history. We can look back at all these documents, like the phone call that these people made. Some of those were recorded either because they were work phone calls, like they're airline employees, or they left messages that then people kept. This woman in the picture, she died. She's in one of the airplanes that was flown into one of the World Trade Center towers. So, people kept it. So we have some of these historical documents, like we do for other events. We can, sift through in that way. So the 9/11 Memorial Site, you can see here's one of the hijackers. I don't know if this is, they got on in Portland, Maine, and then changed planes in Boston. So security was less in, the smaller airport. And this might be Mohammed Atta coming through. So Mohammed Atta was the person who was kind of in charge, like the operations leader on 9/11, and he's from Egypt. Most of the hijackers are from Saudi Arabia. So they're all in one, Morocco, and then Jordan. They're all from American allies. So none are from countries that are hostile to the United States, like Iran or at that time Iraq. We can see, we can trace, we have these kinds of primary sources. Now this is put together, after the fact, but from an airline document that shows everybody was seated on the plane, and the hijackers are in orange. So you can kind of see where they were. Then we have these kinds of documents, like the ID from the person there, and work documents. Other ways to, so one that I think I should do more with this at the beginning of the year in September is a way to kind of talk about how do we draw, how do we construct historical knowledge. How do we know things? There were a lot of questions. Some kids asked specifically about DC because they've heard less about that. When you see a picture of 9/11, like when I said I wanted to do this stream, and Fiveable made a little that graphic. When I tweet stuff out, there's someone who's doing those things who knows more about graphics than I do, or most of the streamers. In any case, so you have an image of the two towers there, the world trip. But so kids had some curiosity what happened in. So I found pictures of that. Give them a more full picture. And this is again part of them is the idea that the Pentagon, where the U.S. military, the Defense Department's headquartered was being attacked, that would be attacked. It was frightening. So here, those planes were on the plane in DC. So the next day in class, you can show the students, well, it's all kind of just to show how this is an event that we can study and learn from. Here's where they sat on the plane. One thing that approaching this as a historian, one thing that made different than doing it as, the way I remembered it was looking at like how long, the after effect was going on. Because I think of like how the fear persisted, and as a person, following the news, kind of the quest for answers and things. And this again would be, for people closer to New York City, just the physicality of the damage and how long that took. That's something that's probably very real in some people's memories, but for others is more of a function of history. We have a couple other people too. So if you kind of one of the things that I've wanted to do is answer students' questions. So one of the things that happened that's difficult maybe to imagine now, yeah. So what do you mean about Gander there, Dylan? I don't think I know that reference. Gander NF. Oh, right, Newfoundland. Oh, right, yeah. Okay, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, Newfoundland is remote, right? Yeah, there were things. Yeah, planes were grounded. I know. My wife, who I didn't know at the time, my current wife, I should say, she was in northern Michigan with her mom, and they were going to fly, so they had to rent a car and drive. I do remember that story about people being stuck there in Newfoundland. One legitimately happened in a short time, and it's kind of it is hard to imagine this. And today is that the that in New York City is President Bush lost the popular vote, but was not an unpopular president on 9/11, but then his approval rating skyrocketed, and even in New York City, people just really welcomed the kind of like personal leadership he provided. And within a few years, that was gone. But it is something to kind of remember that happened. Ooh. I wanted students to understand when we look at this too, again, thinking about how an event like this doesn't just end, even though we know that the events of September 11th confined to that day, that then things, continue. And sometimes I wonder about that as a world history teacher. You go through things, the Mongols sacked Baghdad, 1258. Okay. It's a big event, right? It ends the Abbasid Caliphate, talk about different effects, and there's pictures. It's, some of the Arabic sources are clear that it was pretty brutal what happened, and you kind of go on. But people picking up, people are digging out for a long time. Again, one of the reasons why this sticks with me is, my daughter was a couple months old when the war in Afghanistan started, and she graduated from high school last week. So it just really gives you an idea of how long that war has been going on. Yeah, some students asked about school, and this is the reason I asked about the Pledge of Allegiance, because a lot of those things were, really, really ramped up as a result of that. And like I said, I think enlistments increased, and then the sort of the divisiveness about what what it means to support the country or not. Then when the war in Iraq started, which wasn't directly related to 9/11, it was related to it in the sense that people viewed foreign threats in a different way, but it wasn't different in the sense, but it wasn't connected. Like, no, Iraq wasn't involved with 9/11. They said the 9/11 hijackers are all countries that were friendly with the United States, and one of the things that drew people to terrorism against the United States was, a way to strike at their own government, which the United States was supporting. So Iraq, which was the United States, was not recruitment for Al-Qaeda kind of terrorists, would have viewed Saddam Hussein as a bad Muslim, and that's what Bin Laden said. And that's, he wasn't. He said he was a Muslim, but he wasn't. He wasn't very pious. So, but then being able to dissent about that that's within a few years where things became more fractious, in the educational system, in classroom discussions and things like that. You may not believe this, those of you who are younger, but you used to be able to go to an airport with somebody and walk right up to the gate with them. Just like little things like that. But I think more significant than that, which ultimately is not a big deal, and there was security before, is like the way that this reinvigorated public displays of patriotism, and in the ways that that could lead to Islamophobia. So when I was looking for this, I found a couple things here, and these are things that I would remember, and people at the time would remember. And like as a historian, and for people who, I don't know if any of you will be in APUSH next year or took APUSH, and the idea of the counterculture, like wearing the flag used to be countercultural because it's against the flag code. It was seen as disrespectful. So people who wanted to be edgy and kind of be patriotic but not be patriotic, like it wasn't cool amongst people who were patriotic. It would, so flag bandanas and American flag shorts and stuff like that were countercultural. They're quoted as, culturally left. But that's changed, and there's continuity and change there. Like that's not just about 9/11, but 9/11's clearly boosted that. So those over the top, displays that the NFL has gotten into, and some of that's related to the kneeling, but some of it isn't. There's gigantic flags, or a gigantic flag displayed horizontally that's been cut in the shape of the United States, the continental U.S. If you've ever seen one of those. But, I mean, that is against the flag code in like 2 or 3 different ways. But since it's coded as patriotic, it's something that people are supposed to accept. So here you have an Irish, that's Bono from U2 on the right, an Irish pop singer, rock and roll singer, who's sewn an American flag into a coat. Like somehow, like that becomes something that was widely applauded, right? Those guys put on a great show, and a lot of people watch that. And they displayed the names of all the scrolling list of all the 9/11 victims while YouTube played "Where the Streets Have No Name," which is a little bit melancholic. So, and also song from their. So in some ways, you can kind of look at this and see continuity, but you also see change in ways that 9/11 sort of changed things. Then, as it's also interesting to remember the Iraq War coming out of this and kind of thinking about the question of causation as a history, as somebody who's trying to teach kids to think historically, because on the one hand, there is some cause-effect relationship there. Because, like I said, people were more willing to accept kind of foreign military intervention because they had experienced, this horrible event. Or people were just also a little more trusting. That sort of Vietnam mistrust had worn off a bit. The U.S. had been militarily successful in the first Gulf War, like in 1991, and had a limited objective, which they achieved, and so people became more trusting. And the fact turned out to be policy with a lot of negativities. The whole, judgment on that war is really something now you see like the president in the oil Persian Gulf, and kind of feel like outside of just the country, it's like a big meh. Like people don't, the Iraq War being sold as something that was related to 9/11 when it really wasn't, has then had like a second order effect of increasing, I think, cynicism and distrust that we see here. But it also, begs this question, like this was the people who thought the war was a good war, good idea for other reasons, seized on the mood around 9/11 in order to promote it and use the feelings of patriotism around 9/11 to dampen opposition to it. Is that the same thing as cause? I think that's just a good discussion to have about what causation might be. All right. So that's on the hot link there, the action button. I would like, if people have any other questions that they'd like to put in there or ideas. I kind of ran through Dylan's question that's in there a little bit. But I think for kids, like 9/11 is so distant that I don't know how much it contributed to that. I mean, if anything, it was almost the opposite, where people became more sensitive to it. But I do think the repetition of these school shootings does seem to have made elite students maybe not desensitized, but more fatalistic. Like there's nothing that we can do about this. I'd be curious how you feel as students. I know the day after Parkland was one of the few days I haven't really wanted to go to school as a teacher. I like my job. I was one of the few days I didn't necessarily want to do that in the last few years. So I'm going to change the button to the I'm going to change the button here to the slides in case people want to take a look at those. Oh, good. There's another question. Yeah, I think I do. I mean, I do see sort of a difference in that, because, and this is where this sort of came from. Just like for the first, say, 10 years, and say, I guess one is what happened. So there was this little war was going on at the same time. In ways that's still happening, but a lot of people, it's more in the news. More students knew people who'd been deployed there. Siblings, parents, uncles, aunts. And so it was just, the whole thing was just a little more raw, and some of that could be sadness, but it could also be anger. Either anger, of course, at like terrorists, but also people started to feel deceived around the war in Iraq. We would talk about this a little bit, and kids would be like, "Well, I thought Iraq did 9/11." I'd be like, "Well, no, that doesn't mean, the Iraqi regime, there's Saddam Hussein was a bad dude, so being out of power, there is going to always be some good that came out of that war." Sort of talk about that, and then like, "Well, what are we doing there then?" I'm like, "Well, I'm not sure how to answer that." And so But now that both of these things are kind of in the rearview mirror, it's really more kids are sort of curious, and I sense like more kind of curiosity around it, and they know that it's really important for some adults, but not exactly why. So that's why and then of course some of them have been exposed to some of these, like 9/11 wasn't, one of the questions was on one of those slips was, was 9/11 an inside job? Kind of address that as an aside without putting it on a slide, and that's why I think it's important to treat somewhat historically and be like, well, here's the documentation. Like, here's how we know this in the same way that we know any other history thing. And of course, we might learn new things about it. And there's some unanswered questions. So we should always say this is our best guess right now. But that's a guess. It's more than a guess. This is our best interpretation right now, supported by the evidence. Here, this actually, instead of doing the whole green thing, I'll just drop it into the chat. Interested in those. But if you are doing a project on this for school, that's really 9/11 Memorial. That is. There we are. Did I come back for you all if I unshared my screen? Yeah. All right. It's a beautiful spring night or summer night here in Minnesota. In any case, people have any other questions or thoughts or comments? Thank you to the small group of you who've joined me here to work through some of these things aloud, think about teaching and history and all that. All right. Well, I think I will say good night then and end the session. A short one. Hope stick around for more Camp Fiveable coming up. I know there's a few others this week. I'm looking forward to learning a little Arabic. I only occasionally have a student who can read Arabic in my class, which is super useful in world history. I have a few students, families are from that part of the world or from Arabic writing part of the world, but I cannot. So always looking to improve my pronunciation. So I know I'll be checking that one out. So I'll bump into some of you in the chats there. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. We'll see you.